Well, I have to first admit to all of you that I'm not a curator. I'm not a librarian. I'm what they call a user. So I'm one of those people who actually comes and uses the material which many of you work very hard to preserve and make available to the public. The project that I work with, and will first show you, is one I've worked with for a long time, and that is one of the #1 cultural heritages of Korea, are 13th century printing blocks of the Buddhist canon. There are 83,000 of these blocks carved on both sides. I will talk to you about the ways in which I have tried to image these. The problem that I face, and for many of us, is that very often the data which we have is not organized. Doesn't have good metadata, and we're constantly trying to figure out how to deal with it. So when I come to work with the Buddhist canon, I've gone all over China to many of the museums and universities. Each one has examples of some of the witnesses, but to be able to understand the context of those witnesses is very hard. So here's just a chart that I'm showing you. It's done by temporality. These are all printing block sets that are equivalent of the one I work with in Korea. You can see that they relate to one another. Sometimes they were copied from ones that came before them. And you get an idea of the extent of the witnesses which someone in my field has to work with. And the reason I show you this and make you look at all that is to say the context in which we find these examples in libraries and museums is often not known. The museum has an example, but you don't know what that example, how it relates to all of the material that's available throughout the world. So part of imaging for me is to put things into some form of context. I learned quite a while ago that as a humanist, and I have to admit to you that I do not like the idea of digital humanities. We don't say digital physics. We don't say digital chemistry. None of those fields are so unsure of themselves in the technical world that they have to say those who use technology are set aside as somehow special. I think we need to stop thinking that way in the humanities. Of course we use the digital, but that doesn't mean that we aren't still humanists. Anyway, what I've tried to work with is I have so much data. It's so complicated at times, as you could see from my previous film. And how in the world can I find one thing that I want? And that's where I think image and color become really important. I was trained that you take all your bits of information, you put them together, and you get the pure total picture. And that if you get the whole total picture, then it's finished. But there's a great problem with that in today's world. I go to sleep at night, and by the time I wake up in the morning, hundreds or thousands of pages of data have been added to the internet. We are constantly being beset with the issue that we have always unincorporated data that we never dealt with before. So it's as if I put together a jigsaw puzzle, but during the night, because of the unincorporated data, the pieces separate. And I wake up in the morning and the picture's gone, and I have to try to reconstruct it. But the next morning, it's gone. It's almost like a Greek tragedy. Well, it took me a long time, but I digitized all of the material on the printing blocks. It took me 10 years. I started too early. I started in 1988. We didn't have the software. We didn't have the memory. We didn't have the fonts. I mean, it was crazy to start then. But some people have said that that's a very good metadata category for me. After doing it, I made myself a promise, because in the early years for us in the humanities, the first big set of data came from the Greek material. Mr. Packard has 2 children of Hewlett-Packard, and he asked them, what one big gift do you want in your life from me? So his daughter said, I want the Monterey Aquarium, because she's an aquarium or a biologist. So he gave her the aquarium. His son, who was in classics, said, I want all the Greek literature digitized from the earliest time up to 600. There was no font, there was no software, there was no hardware, but Mr. Packard put it together, and he took the Greek texts off to have them input. They did the input in Korea. They used Koreans who could not read Greek. They didn't want them to read Greek. They didn't want them to think, because people who think make more mistakes typing. After it was over, I asked a colleague of mine at Berkeley, I said, you've got all this Greek literature. Wow, it must really change the way you do your work. No. No, I'm doing the same thing. Maybe it's a little easier, a little faster, but no. And I was shocked. I'm often shocked. So I said, after working 10 years to put the Buddhist canon in, I said, all right. I talk to myself sometimes. I said, Lou, 5 years after you finish, you must ask yourself the same question. Have you really changed the way you do your work because you have this material in digital form? I did. To my shame, I had to say, not much. And I was ashamed, because I had just talked people into spending close to $4 million to do this. And I said, I'm a fraud. $4 million, and it's not changed the way I do my work? So I made myself sit for 2 weeks to think about, if I did use this in a different way, totally different way, how would I do it? And I thought, and I thought. I couldn't come up with anything, except one day I said to myself, what have you always done? The answer is, read. Aha. The answer is then, don't read. When that came to me, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I mean, I'm a word merchant. What do you mean, not read? But that's what I set out to do. If I don't read, how in the world can the material communicate itself to me? It must do it in patterns. I have to be able to create patterns. So how can I create patterns from 52 million Chinese characters that are contained on 160,000 pages? So I took each character from the printing block, and I turned it to a blue dot. I completely abstracted it. I put behind each of these a lot of metadata. I had already cataloged the entire set of printing blocks, and so I put all the categories in my catalog behind each dot, so the computer knows that dot is this text, this line, this character, translated in what year, by what person, at what place. All that is known by the computer. So once I had created this, then I made panes of blue dots, which are exactly the equivalent of the printing block. And wherever the word I'm searching for occurs, it turns the dot red, so that I can immediately see in a pattern the word occurrence pattern, which normally takes weeks of time for me to determine by going through one at a time, saying, what year was this translated, and making little sheets and, you know, this. So this compared to the way in which most people use the material, which is to use the Google search. If I have 5,000 examples, I have the Google pages after page after page. I have to click for each example to be able to have any kind of context viewing of how that word is occurring. Takes a long, long time. And mostly, we don't do it. So that's why I turned to patterning. After patterning, people ask me, well, what do you learn when you look at the pattern of occurrence? And you learn something, but at the same time, you need to develop an analytic which tells you what that image means in other imagery. So that means graphs, line graphs, supercomputer analytics. I found out that supercomputer in Illinois was absolutely overwhelmed that somebody from the humanities would come to them and say, will you help me? Because they're supposed to use 10% of their time for the humanities, and nobody ever comes. So when I came, it was like suddenly I was embraced, and it was free, and they did lots of stuff for me. Wonderful. So analytics came in, and for the first time as a humanist, I realized that Galton was right. If you can count, count. I had been a qualitative scholar. I had never thought that I needed to be quantitative. I didn't even know what a humanist could do with quantitative data. Counting, what's counting got to do with it? Since I decided not to read, I had to turn to counting. And when I began to count and I began to get the patterns of the occurrences, I then made myself sit down and I wrote an article where I did not read anything. I wrote the article from the patterns. And I was amazed myself that I chose a word which was well studied. I knew what people had said about it. I wanted that ground truth. And I could equal most of the scholarship that had been done on the word just by my patterns. I knew when it was first used. I knew the texts, as I'll show you in a minute, that were anomalous. I knew exactly how often it had been used. I could see the history of this word just from counting. Well, when I took it to the supercomputer, they came back with things like this, and I was like, you're kidding me. I can't use this. What does it mean? And they said, well, that's what the computer does. So I have a friend who is working with me on some of this. He does Danish folklore. He has 250,000 Danish folk tales collected in the early part of the 20th century by an ethnographer who must have been a very compulsive person who went door to door throughout most villages of large parts of Denmark and collected any story which people in the house knew. He recorded this in a kind of code. He didn't write Danish, he wrote a code, shorthand. But he put the address, he put the name of the person who told the story, And my friend, who is at UCLA, who was Italian by heritage, deciphered it. And I said, his name is Tim Tangolini, and I said, Tim, how in the world does a good Italian-American decipher coded Danish? Well, his father is a physicist, and he grew up in Copenhagen as a kid wandering the streets, and he picked up all the patois of the local language in Danish, so he could do it. We took his 250,000 with all that information about who told it and what the address was, and we sent it to the supercomputer, and we said, without telling the computer anything about it, tell us if you can spot a pattern. Computer worked long and hard. Even the supercomputer took some hours. But after a while, it finally came back and said, you have two distinct types of stories. Tim started looking. He could not figure out what it was. He looked at the content, ghost stories. Both had ghost stories. He looked at all the content. And then finally, he realized what the computer had done, which shows us the power of the computer logical analysis. The computer had spotted 100% correct, mind you, whether the person who told the story was a man or a woman. You couldn't believe it. And it did it through GIS, Geographic Information Systems. It said, in the stories, what are the place names? And it knew those place names, and it mapped the place names for each story and came up with the fact that some stories, all the place names in the story were near the address. And in other cases, the place names in the stories were 100 miles away or 50 miles away. Women only told stories with the place names around them. The men told stories with towns that were far distant because they traveled at that time and the women didn't. So we've learned from the supercomputer to analyze our data in ways which we would never know ourselves. In other words, the computer's going to tell us some things that are surprising. Well, recently, I was given a challenge grant. The challenge grant was that I had to sit down with a chemical engineer who has a program called Prime and figure out how to use his software for my Buddhist text on printing blocks from Korea. His data is combustion, it's soot, he studies soot, and we worked for over a year. I would have headaches because I couldn't figure out how I could possibly use this. His program is wonderful. You can put in chemical, temperature, pressure, and it looks through almost 250,000 articles and pulls the data that relates to those three elements and predicts what would happen if you actually ran that experiment in the lab. Shows you the range. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. It's predictive of the future. If you did this and this, the range would be this. So you don't have to do it. But we have added to that something which we have added to it, that if somebody does one of these analytics, then we want them to annotate the analytic. We want them to tell us what they think about it right then and there and publish it. We want a new kind of publication where an analytic is presented to us that we may not be able to produce ourselves, but the expert who could produce it says, here's the analytic that I got, and this is what I think it means, and make it available to us on a peer-reviewed basis so that we can quote it. Well, for myself, when I started counting, I found out that if I arranged my word occurrences in time, that I got a kind of profile. How many times in a given year is my character word occurring? Then I was using character, and people always ask me, what were you looking for? This is reading. I'm sorry, I did read this 2 characters, which normally means, people say, original enlightenment. From my patterns, I decided that's a wrong translation. Also, using prime, reversed it. Instead of the future, I asked the prime program to look back in time and predict the past. I wanted it to look at the word occurrences and see if, based on what it saw, that it could tell me whether there were anomalies. And it can. That spike in the 2nd century is an anomaly. It shouldn't be there. It's a misstated text. Somebody put the wrong date on it. You would not have a text which uses a word hundreds of times and then it doesn't appear in any text for 300 years. The software says, I don't see any other examples of this. People had already spotted that this was probably the case. Our software was able to do it in about 20 seconds. We have other visualizations, chiastic modeling, that is ring composition. You have an opening statement S, you have A, B, C, then you have D, which says however, but, and then the same phrases occur in reverse order until you come back to a closing phrase, which is very much like the beginning phrase. This is the Iliad. This is the structure of the Odyssey. This is the structure of the Bible. This is the structure of Chinese novels. This is the structure of any detective story. This is the structure of poetry. So I asked the computer, look for chiastic models in the Chinese canon. And it begins to find them. That is, they are there. And the big thing that you're looking for is that the central message of the model is at the but, however. The rest of it is just a frame for that. So if you read just from one chiastic model to the other, you really get the flow of the text which you otherwise do not see. And nobody has seen this in the work that the material I use. They just complain about all the repetitions. Endless repetitions. Why in the world do they repeat these things over and over? They don't mean anything. Structurally, they mean a lot. If you're interested in this, Mary Douglas's book, Thinking in Circles, wonderful book on this very issue. So I've brought this to here, to Hong Kong. We have put my blue dots into the 3D environment. We are trying to put in all of the other materials which you see. You've been in this place. One of the great joys of my life was to finally be able to walk through my texts, to see them all around me, to revel in them, to be able to read up to 80 pages or see 80 pages at once with their patterns instead of 2 pages in front of me. A whole different parameter. Well, let me quickly go on to say the other thing that I do is to pattern through cultural atlases. And this is another way in which you use image to give you enormous amounts of data which you can understand. So I put in all of the mosques of China. And when I do them, we see a surprise. Who knew that recently most of the mosques being built anew in China are up there north of Korea? North Korea ever opens its doors, Islam is there ready. I took it to the supercomputer people and I said, look and see. Does the destruction or reconstruction of a mosque in China depend on how far it is from Beijing? In other words, do they do it way out there before they do it here? I came back and said, no. The reconstruction of the mosque happened throughout China, same year. However, what we found is the kind of white line that you see, the Cultural Revolution. It was able to map the Cultural Revolution in a way which I think is even more accurate than the normal historical dating of it. When did the Cultural Revolution start destroying the mosque? When did the Cultural Revolution stop and they started reconstructing? The effective dates of the Cultural Revolution are shown from GIS. Who would know it? So there you see, after the Cultural Revolution was over, the number of mosques that were reconstructed. I also have done 4,000 Tibetan Buddhist monasteries. And there the surprise is that something I've been trying to tell people in Tibetan studies, and nobody will listen to me. There are two Tibets. There's the area around Lhasa. That's what everybody thinks of as Tibet. But there is an equal number of Buddhist monastic sites in China, in Yunnan, Sichuan, Qinghai Plateau. These places are just as important to the Tibetan tradition as the ones down around Lhasa. Nowadays, of course, we're hearing these tragic stories of the young people in that region burning themselves because of what they see to be suppression of their tradition. Supercomputer tells me we can look at the affiliations of these and begin to see which ones are of which school and how do those schools connect to one another. Is there a bridge between them? If there's a bridge, who is it that's done that bridge, or which monasteries have done it? So you can present data in many ways. NASA spent many years going around the world looking for a cloudless night on every spot on Earth. They did it for every place except the Amazon. There are certain parts of the Amazon they never found a cloudless night. The lights of the world are the image of today's world. That's what today's world looks like. I tried to sketch out some of the ancient trade routes and lay them down against the modern world, so that here you have the ancient world in the colored lines and you have the lights with the present day world. Some of those routes are still marked by the lights of present day habitation. So this is what's happened to me. People sometimes call me a pioneer. I have to remind them, you know, that's not a very nice thing to say to somebody. The root of the word pioneer is peon. It's pioneer. It means somebody who is a nobody, who's a foot soldier, who goes in front of the knights on shining armor, clears the way for them, and then those on the white horses come riding through and delight themselves. So I've gone from reading printing blocks with a mirror because they're carved backwards, to now standing here in Hong Kong at the half cave and watching my text flow over, around, and under me. And as we go forward and we begin to analyze and to realize that this new digital age can truly change our paradigm. Thank you.
Thank you. When you are using the blue dots to spatially orient the characters, was that the first display method that you tried to visualize those patterns, or were there other visualization methods that you tried to do that, and were they either more or less effective in different ways?
Actually, it was the first. And what I was after was that I felt that people who use natural language in their modeling confuse the brain. You can't figure your way through all that. So these things that give you all the words and make some big and some small, your brain is clicking out something, but it's very confusing to the brain. So I got this idea from a young computer scientist. He said, I'm going to teach you something very complex in a tenth of a second. Well, I said, yeah, sure. These computer scientists, you know. So he filled the screen with 1 million blue dots. He turned one of them red for a tenth of a second, and everybody in the room saw it. He said, do you realize what you just did? You disambiguated 1 out of 1 million in a tenth of a second. That is the power of image and color. The brain is set up for that. 41% of it is wired for that. We are doing education as if language and reading is what the brain is built for, but it isn't. The brain hates reading. That's why some people can't read. The brain just says, what is this? I don't like this. Give me an image any day. So from that, I thought, I need to not read, and the only way I know not to read is I've got to take that character away, but I replace it with something.
Thank you.
One part of your speech that I was fascinated by, but I wanted to know a little bit more about, and that was the, what did you call it, skiastic?
The chiastic model.
Chiastic model. And could you just tell us a little bit more about what you discovered and not so much how, but what was discovered there? I didn't quite understand that. You said it goes in this, I didn't get it.
Well, Mary Douglas, who wrote that book, has a very compelling story. She spent 4 years doing the book of Numbers in the Hebrew Bible. Book of Numbers is usually considered by biblical scholars as the most chaotic, big mess that you've ever seen, and nobody understands it. She proved that the book of Numbers is the most elegantly structured book in the Bible. It is a series of rings. Those rings make a bigger ring, and that there are bigger rings that make another ring, until finally the entire text itself is a chiastic ring. Now, if you want to try this, I'll tell you something, a secret. You want to make an audience feel comfortable with what you speak to them about? Give your speech as a chiastic ring. That is, always end with something you started with, and people feel really comfortable. Mary Douglas says it's built into our brains. Our very survival depended, she says, on the fact that a hunter went out, and they went till they finally came and killed something. Now you got to get home. How do you get home? You've got to do all of the things you saw backwards, and then you're home. And there's a part of us that loves that. So it's structured in the brain in a way. But what it says is all those frames, I don't have to read them for meaning anymore. I read them as frames, and what I'm reading is the however. I'm reading the D that was in the ring. When I read the Ds, it makes perfect sense. None of us spotted that. So I mentioned this to a young scholar who was just starting out here in Hong Kong, Buddhist monk who's got his PhD from the University of Hong Kong. And he won their graduate prize for his dissertation. He took one of the Buddhist texts and proved that the whole text is a chiastic ring, and that the real message of it was something that nobody had ever spotted as being the main message, because he found the however in the chiastic ring of the 38 chapters. So that's why we use it. I hope that helps. Get Mary Douglas's book. It's really fun to read. Mary Douglas. It's called Thinking in Circles.
Got a few more minutes. Any more questions?
Digital humanities, right?
Yes.
But obviously, what I see in your presentation is the digital humanities that I learned from books. All this data imaging and cross-disciplinary visualizing of knowledge, or something. So, what do you think is a better word, or is a better way to address this kind of new school discipline, or discipline of knowledge?
See, what I worry about is that I'm a true believer in transdiscipline studies. But transdiscipline is not interdisciplinary. It is not cross-disciplinary. Transdisciplinary has a very specific definition, which is you first establish what is your problem. Once you know what your problem is, you bring everybody you can to help you do it. You don't do it by discipline. You don't say, oh, I think I need to solve this by psychology, or I need to solve this by the computer, or no, you bring everything. So people say, yeah, but people don't work together that well. And after all, I'm a humanist, and I was taught the best stuff is done by a single human brain, not by teams. So I looked around and I decided that the most extraordinary example of transdiscipline work is World War II. Everybody identified the problem, defeat the enemy. They brought everything they had to play on that problem. It didn't matter if you were a woman or a physicist or an engineer or a coding person. Everybody worked. So I feel I have always been a humanities scholar. What I have worked with is my data. I never went over I'm not a computer person. Of course I use it in my humanities. So I use computing with my humanistic studies, but I do not start a new discipline called digital humanities. I hate that idea because then it will just codify itself, become concrete, and be another discipline, and it will destroy what I think we all need to do, which is transdiscipline, where we don't think in those terms. You can see I get wound up.
Well, actually, I'm not asking about a new label to this kind of knowledge. I'm just thinking that from the point of view of the student, of newcomers, so how can we describe to people that I want those dots appear in circles, blue dots, red dots? So it seems that it takes a lot of energy to really illustrate what you really want in the analysis.
But I say to all the students who come to me, make sure that you understand what we need is your expertise. We don't need you to become a programmer. There are lots of programmers. You go get one to help you. Don't do it. You'll never be any good at it. Or if you are, you'll probably stop doing your other humanities work and you'll just become a computer specialist, which is all right. It is computing that is used for my discipline. And my contribution to all of this is that I have read these texts, I have worked with the material that's on these plates, so when the computer comes back with material, I have something to offer. I don't have much to offer the supercomputer people and all of those. But when they come back to me, I have some ground truth because that's my expertise. I have read, and I continue to read, but I worry that people who say they are becoming a digital humanities person, I don't know what that means. I don't know what it means. Because I want somebody who really understands the content. I want people to have their expertise. No.
All right. Thank you.